Another big story this week has been the assisted dying bill, and concerns have been raised after it was announced by its sponsor, Kim Leadbeater, that the requirement for a High Court judge to sign off individual cases was going to be scrapped. And instead, it's likely that an expert panel will now scrutinise those decisions instead. Now, we're recording this at a time that we haven't got the precise details, we haven't got the wording yet of any amendments, but this is a clear fault line in the bill. And we have a question about it as well. So Joni Adams has been in touch and she asks, what moderates the power of the bill? Now, I'm going to interpret that to mean kind of what are the checks, what are the safeguards in place? And Megan, you've interviewed Kim Leadbeater very recently for the New Statesman. This came up in conversation, didn't it?
Yeah, so I spoke to Kim shortly before she announced she would table an amendment which removed the requirement for a High Court judge. And she kind of gave me a little bit more detail on what exactly the panel of experts would look like.
I was always really clear we needed a third layer of safeguarding in this process. Many countries don't have that, and some countries would say to me, actually, Kim, you're making this too difficult for people who are dying by adding all these different layers. And I disagree. I think we need that third layer of safeguarding and scrutiny. And the High Court judge, I think, is a very effective way of doing that. Having that judicial and legal oversight, I think, is really important. Healthcare professionals that you speak to are very clear that if you have a very, very ill patient, they are treated in a multidisciplinary way. So that isn't just a doctor, it's nurses, it might be social workers, it might be psychiatrists. If we brought other expertise in at that level, I think that would actually strengthen the bill and be a more robust process.
Now, it hasn't convinced a lot of people thus far, as it's still early days, but Rachel, you've been interviewing Lord Sumption, who of course sat on the Supreme Court, and it's something that he agreed with, scrapping this.
Yeah, so Lord Sumption was on the Supreme Court when it considered the Nicholson case in 2014, which was all about whether it was for Parliament or judges to decide. And he was called as an expert as part of the committee stages. And his view on the inclusion of a High Court judge making the ruling was either this individual is going to have to look at all the evidence for every case and check that at every stage everyone got it right, which would be very time consuming, or if they're not going to do that, they're just rubber stamping it, then what's the point of having them in the first place? It's more symbolic. And he said before Kim Leadbeater announced that she would be changing this, he said that as a protection, it is largely illusory and undoubtedly very time consuming. So it's basically about what the point of having a judge involved at that point of the process is, which seems to be part of the reason that Leadbeater has now amended that part of the bill.
Yeah, I mean, let's unpick this a bit, because I know in your conversation with Kim Leadbeater, Megan, that she said that some countries that already have these laws, like Australia, I think she mentioned, doesn't she, that they're saying to her, Kim, you don't need this. But she certainly told you, and certainly when the bill was first introduced to Parliament, that she believed very strongly in this extra layer of safeguarding.
Yeah, she did actually say in our interview that she thinks the High Court judge is a very effective way of doing that. But then she did sort of subsequently tell me that she is planning to remove it to put in place this panel of experts. I suppose the reason behind it is, and she had just come from the Ministry of Justice when she was speaking to me, is likely the lack of capacity within the judiciary to do this.
It's just unworkable.
Yeah. And writing in The Guardian when she announced her decision to table this amendment, she did describe the panel of experts as Judge Plus, because the panel will be chaired by a legal figure or a lawyer. But I think Judge Plus is a weird way of putting it, because it's sort of the High Court judge won't be involved.
Right.
So, I think
it's sort of legal plus, judge minus legal
but
social workers.
But it's a tricky situation now, isn't it? Because having argued very vociferously that we're going to be stronger than anywhere else in the world, don't worry, we absolutely want a judge. It's not actually doable, so we won't do that. And interestingly, like several of the papers have been doing the maths on this, Rachel. Yeah. And I think 60 MPs specifically said at second reading, I voted for this because of that very specific safeguard.
Yeah, so there are 60 MPs who cited the inclusion of a High Court judge as being part of their decision-making process. The bill passed a second reading with a majority of 55, which means 28 people would need to change their minds for it to fail at third reading, although obviously people could change their minds in another direction. But 28 is what you're looking for. The Independent has added up and suggested that there are 140 MPs who might change their votes. Now that is
actually lists them as well, doesn't it? Into different categories.
It lists them in different categories, although some of them are not listed because they've expressed their doubts privately. So I think that at this stage, nobody knows is the key. And I was in the 5-hour debate in November when MPs actually discussed this. And one of the things that I remember very clearly was a lot of the MPs who stood up to make speeches in favour of voting at second reading, their argument was, I'm voting, I think this was Lena Moran's argument, I'm voting in favour so that we keep talking about this. Or David Davis was like, I'm voting in favour so that we have the time to look at this. It wasn't, I'm definitely going to vote for it at third reading. It was, I want the conversation to continue. So even at that stage, there were MPs who were arguing that it needed more time and more consideration and more thought. So what that means now is we just don't know what the numbers are going to be and whether this change, the High Court judge, is going to make a difference to whether it passes at third reading.
So that's certainly one area of safeguarding that people are debating over, sort of the role or not of the judiciary. Another one, it seems to me, Megan, seems to be about this issue of coercive control, and it's something that Sarah Dighton wrote for the new Statesman.com for us this week. The argument being that this law, she says, has been written as though male violence and coercive control do not exist, and in fact, the only witness called to discuss this couldn't make it, and then they didn't speak to anyone about it. But actually, Kim Leadbeater did sort of touch on this briefly in her interview with you, doesn't she? Do you think this might be something else that might be strengthened?
Yeah, she did tell me that she's planning to strengthen the bill around multiple opportunities to sort of check for coercion and check for that sort of pressure. And she said she is planning to lay an amendment relating to this. I did push her on what that might be, and I haven't had the details yet, but I'm sure once we get a full text of the amendments, we'll be able to see what exactly she has planned. So, yeah.
Another sort of area of discussion has been like, where would this sit? I mean, we know that in terms of departmental responsibility, it's going to be the Ministry of Justice and also obviously the Department for Health and Social Care. Did Kim Leadbeater offer any sort of thoughts on how it would interact, or whether even it could be separate to the NHS?
Yeah, so I did ask Kim Leadbeater directly where this will sit. Will it be within the NHS? And she said she thinks it shouldn't be a separate service. It should be within the NHS because it should be about having an array of options for people coming to the end of their lives who are terminally ill. And assisted dying shouldn't be sort of separate from that. It shouldn't be its own separate service. And she said that for those doctors who feel that they don't want to participate in this, who are sort of conscientious objectors to it, it will be an opt-in service. So it won't be that when you train to become a doctor, you absolutely have to deliver assisted dying. But yeah, I thought that was quite interesting that she sees it very firmly within NHS services, which it should be noted, the NHS, I don't think there's a day where there isn't a headline about how stretched it is in terms of capacity. So, I think it will be interesting kind of seeing how they manage to carve out a space for it if it is to be in the NHS.
I think it's fair to say that even those who are supportive of the bill, and certainly the principle of the bill, have been quite critical about the process, whether that's the choice of witnesses that the committee chose to call, or some of the mood, if you like, of the questioning. How unique have you found this process, Rachel, as a close Commons watcher, and the idea that we really don't know whether this is going to pass or not?
Yeah, it's really unusual because usually government legislation passes because they've got a majority. And if it's an issue where they expect a rebellion, you're watching a small number of MPs from the governing party as to which way they will vote. And this one, it was very clear watching the debate because it was going it goes party by party, sort of one Labour, one not Labour, one Labour, one not Labour. And usually that means 1 for, 1 against, 1 for, 1 against. And it was totally mixed. You get kind of 3 for in a row and then 2 against, and they're all different parties. And you also had MPs delivering speeches that were, I felt, of a higher quality than you normally get in debate, because they were really having to think about how they personally felt about the issue, not how their party wanted them to vote, with the possible exception, I suppose, of Rupert Lowe, who is the Reform MP, who put a poll on his constituency website and just said, how do my constituents want me to vote, and voted for. He's one of the ones who has now come out and said that, in part because of the High Court judge changes, he'd now be voting against. But generally, it was MPs really trying to sort of grapple with the issues. And there was a lot in the debate about kind of what Parliament is for and how legislation should be debated. Alicia Cairns, the Conservative MP, was speaking in favour of the bill at second reading. She made a point that actually this bill, this legislation, has probably been scrutinised more closely line by MPs than the vast majority of stuff where the government just kind of puts legislation in front of MPs and goes, could you vote for this, please? And the opposition goes, no. David Davis talked about how it needed proper time and proper scrutiny, and he was calling on the government to kind of allow that process, which was interesting because this isn't government legislation, it's a private member's bill, although the government has been assisting Kim Leadbeater in this. So it sits in a really interesting space in terms of the parliamentary process. It is really unusual that we have something and we just don't know what the end result will be. And it is really unusual to have something that is so cross-party. We talked about this on the podcast before the second reading about some polling that was done, and you can't actually predict how people are going to feel about this issue based on which party they vote for, and that makes it quite unique as well.
I just wonder, Megan, when you were speaking to Kim Leadbeater, whether you got a sense of how this is taking its toll on her. I mean, it is an enormous responsibility for one woman, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think this is something that I've really thought about since I spoke to her. I think she is so passionate, and she was very full of energy, excited about the bill. But I can't help thinking that, you know, it's a lot to put on one person, and should we be doing as big an issue as this through the mode of a private member's bill? I mean, I don't really know how else we would do it in our parliamentary system, but it just feels like by only having one person essentially held to account for this, that there are sort of more opportunities for things to get missed or for it to become almost too personal, when, although this is a very, very personal issue, I don't doubt that, it's legislation which is fundamentally, it shouldn't be personal. It should be robust and have the right scrutiny and things like that. So yeah, Kim Leadbeater, I did ask her about the criticism of the bill, and she sort of responded to some of the points kind of that it's been rushed, or about her own approach to it.
People are entitled to their own opinions, but as someone who is living and breathing this, I can tell you, A, it isn't been rushed, B, it is being done extremely thoroughly, and C, there are some fantastic people working very, very hard on it. And I include parliamentarians, but I also include civil servants in the Ministry of Justice, in the Department for Health, the clerks who are working on the bill committee, and the many, many people who keep contacting me with additional evidence and expertise and opinions. So there's a huge amount of work going on.
Let's just finish by asking both of you what you think the chances of this bill actually succeeding, and, well, this huge change in the way we live coming into effect.
I didn't want to make predictions before the second reading, and then when I was in the debate, I felt that it was tipping towards MPs passing it, and that was right, and they did. It's very difficult to say given everything that else has come out. I think there are probably enough pro voices, with the argument being that it will be a generation before we debate this again. I think that one is probably foremost in MPs' minds, but I wouldn't want to put any money on it either way.
Megan?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I wouldn't want to put any money on it either, but I have spoken to one MP who had initially voted in favour of the bill. They described this to me as sort of a distressing decision, has decided they won't vote for it again because they're just worried about it not being given adequate time and the safeguards not being there. So I think, I think we'll probably see more people turning against who were previously for, but I wouldn't want to call it this far out.